You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 266 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm going to be discussing America's role in three wars that are currently going very poorly, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria, and then some other news as well. For those of you who'd like to share this show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, or the best place really to go to find all my work, libertarianinstitute.org, and my daily news roundup is there as well. Also want to mention that this show was supposed to be an interview of Mance Rayder, the host of the Free Man Beyond the Wall podcast, and the author of two books, The Kids Are Not All Right and Freedom Through Memedom. The audio file came out very poor. You really can't understand it, to be honest. So I'm going to see what I could do to fix it up. I'm really hoping I could salvage it. It was an excellent interview. I hope I didn't waste an hour of Mance's time there. So I will recommend, though, for those of you who are interested in Mance Rayder, as somebody I want to have as a guest on the show, on the show notes page, I'm going to link to episode 152 of Mance's show and 175. 152 is an interview with Angela Keaton and Scott Horton of antiwar.com, and the second one is an interview with the, I believe, CEO of minds.com, which is an alternative media website. So those two interviews of Mance's is kind of the subjects that we were going to cover on the show that we are supposed to have. Like I said, hopefully I'll be able to salvage it and put out a fantastic conversation for you guys. But highly recommend you check that out and Mance's work overall. He's a very brave voice in the libertarian movement and does not shy away from the foreign policy and the wars in the empire whatsoever. So even if you're not a libertarian, I will follow him on Twitter because there's some pretty good stuff, on the war issue. Very blunt, very forward there. All right. To start with some news going on today, I read one from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com this morning. The intelligence budget is up 11.6%. I believe that's under Trump. I think that, really nears the intelligence budget, a combination of, I think, the CIA budget and then the military intelligence budget to near $100 billion. A huge amount of this money, I'm sure, ends up being directed, as surveillance towards us ordinary American civilians. And, here's our tax dollars and debt put on ourselves and the future generations of Americans being spent, to surveil on us from the government. It's important to remember, kind of the CIA operations, famous ones including, operating a coup in Iran in 1956, something that, later leads to the Islamic Revolution in Iran and, creates a hostile situation, I guess, or at least the Americans create a hostile situation out of it, in the long run, where we no longer, have even a remotely friendly government, in Iran. To the torture and rendition, program, kidnapping people all over the place and then torturing them. And of course, the arming and, funding of Syrian rebel groups, in the early stages of the Syrian civil war, which ended up only empowering jihadist rebels. Oh, and then you could also look to them back in the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And, again, look how that turns out. So these are agencies looking at their track record. We probably should be looking to cut their budget rather than increase it. But, definitely going in the wrong direction there. Khashoggi continues to unfold. The Turks are now claiming, and I think this would go against previous claims in some ways, that Khashoggi was murdered by strangulation as soon as he entered the consulate. I don't think they have his body, and they say he was dismembered, so it's hard to maybe determine how this was the case. It does seem that this would conflict with earlier claims that he was tortured and that he had a phone conversation with Mohammed bin Salman before he was killed. It would also go against the Saudi claim that this was an interrogation or confrontation gone wrong, and it would be then a premeditated murder plot. I still think it's hard, to anywhere kind of guess at what the truth is here, or even if what actually happened is anywhere near what, the claims being made right are now. All these governments, the United States, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, who have, been involved in the releasing of this evidence, have very political reasons to, drive the conversation in one way or the other. And so, it's very possible that they're lying to us still. That being said, there are real things happening as a result of the story that's put out and widely believed, and that is Saudis orchestrated, or at least in the knowledge of, Crown Prince and in large part ruler of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, had this journalist murdered by some of his bodyguards and close advisors, possibly torturing him before dismembering him. One of those outcomes, and this is something that just isn't in the news enough in general, is that the U.S. has been engaged for quite a while now in nuclear energy talks with Saudi Arabia, I guess selling them nuclear reactors in exchange, well, I guess, just for money. However, the United States has wanted to do this 1-2-3 style agreement that I believe they started with the Emirates, that would prevent the enriching of uranium above a certain percentage and would be essentially a little bit of a safeguards agreement as well to make sure that the civilian nuclear program doesn't turn into a government nuclear weapons program. I believe the Saudis want to be able to enrich uranium up to whatever percent they want, and they really don't want safeguards on this, and they want the Americans to sell them the, kind of reactors that produce the kind of nuclear waste that could actually be pretty easily changed into the material needed to make a nuclear weapon. 5 senators, including Rand Paul and Marco Rubio, so 5 Republicans worth mentioning, have signed a letter saying that the U.S. should suspend these talks. The U.S. should kill these talks, because you really had to wonder, with as brutally as Saudi Arabia has so far, treated Yemen, to what lengths they would go to try to put some kind of face on that war. I guess it may be a little bit much to speculate that they would use nuclear weapons. However, they're, kind of currently starving the entire population to death. Martha Mundy on the Scott Horton show mentioned this, and I guess she said that, she can't reveal the source of this, but a high-ranking member of the Saudi royal family said that, the Houthis could eat, the people of Yemen could eat when they're ready to comply with the Saudi law. So, this would definitely mean that the starvation of the Yemeni people is intentional. And at that point, when your morality is there, to what lengths you would go to defeat that enemy, it's definitely a risk and a reason why you want to give those people nuclear weapons. We also have Secretary of Defense James Mattis calling for a ceasefire in Yemen within 30 days. Having these talks would require Saudi Arabia to lift their airspace restrictions over Yemen and allow the Houthis, and give them safe passes to travel somewhere to actually have talks. They prevented that in the past. It could, we're so close to the midterms right now, this could really just be a political stunt, a political ploy to make it look like the Trump administration is being tough on Saudi Arabia leading up to the midterms. I mean, calling for something to happen within the next month gives plenty of time for Saudi Arabia to create a narrative that blames the Houthis for the talks not being successful. However, it could also be a, real threat from the United States, like wrap this up in 30 days, guys, or else, we may withdraw support or something like that. Who knows what the communications are going on behind the scenes, but hopefully the Trump administration is serious about this. I'm going to link to an episode of Around the Empire, a show hosted by Joanne Leon. The guest on that show is Major Danny Sjursen. I had not heard of him until 6 months to a year ago. He started publishing his work at antiwar.com and was on the Scott Horton show. And so he's, I believe, still active duty, teaches history now, I believe. But he's mentioned that he's on his way getting out of the military, but he's a combat veteran, talks about, how he, believe both deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, and, very good interviews if, you just Google up Scott Horton, Danny Sjursen. But he writes this great article at antiwar.com. Again, I'll link to this one on the show notes page, called The Myth of the Magical Soldier. And in this article, and then I think very well explained in his interview with Joanne Leon, he explains the problem that people think, and I think U.S. politicians are the main drivers of this, and think tank people, that if you stick a couple hundred or a couple thousand U.S. troops somewhere, you're going to be able to turn whatever society it is into a liberal democracy. And I think for me, reading this article and realizing how true this myth is, really, helps to understand why so many Americans continue to go along with our foreign policy. In the episode, Danny talks a little bit about why, he believes this is the case. There's a lot of glorification of the military. There's not, a lot of exposure, especially for the bulk of the people of the United States, of, the kind of long-term effects on the soldiers and stuff like that. And, or even exposure to the soldiers at all. And it allows the U.S. foreign policy to be the, U.S. soldiers are going to go anywhere in the world and they're going to kill the bad people and save the good people, liberate the women and the minorities and, all the different religious groups, and create a situation in any country, just like the United States, where people don't kill each other for power. Everybody has the right to go to school and all these other ideas. Now, I want to talk about this, kind of myth in context of the wars in Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria. And we could start off here with Afghanistan, just because I think it becomes clear as to why the Americans think they could put 15,000 Americans in Afghanistan and that would somehow change anything, other than just making them targets for the local population. We had the invasion of Afghanistan all the way back in 2001, late 2001. So we're on like 17 years of this now. And it was getting some numbers out. It is absolutely astounding. 9% of the Afghani population lives in districts of Afghanistan that are completely controlled by the Taliban. An entire district controlled by the Taliban. Over 41% of Afghanis live in districts that are contested by the Taliban. And so this means that, the Taliban probably control a little bit of it. They carry out some operations and, these are probably areas where there's more active war zones and fighting going. So if you look at that, after 17 years, over 50% of the people don't live in areas controlled by the government backed by the U.S. soldiers. And so if that's the case, then it's just obviously seen as unwinnable. Like this, should mean we can't do it. Especially when you look at that 17 years when the U.S.-backed government was able to control more of the territory. There were offers from the Taliban, to recognize the government in Kabul. And so there were possibilities for this thing to have been a better negotiated deal for the United States, but now we're moving in the wrong direction. In fact, James Mattis admitted that over 1,000 Iraqi military personnel were killed or wounded in August and September of this year alone. This is interesting just because for quite a while now, the Pentagon has refused to give out these numbers, claiming it was at the behest of the Afghani central government. I think it's a very dangerous thing that if, the war is going so poorly for you that you can't even, admit to the amount of soldiers killed and wounded in the war, that would either lower morale or hurt recruitment or embolden the Taliban, then you're in big trouble. And so, one of these other signs that this war is an absolute failure. If you look at just in land area, I believe the areas controlled or contested by the Taliban are again over 50%. And, I think they control more area, that's like kind of lightly populated. And this is going to be the hardest area, the more tribal rural areas for the Americans to ever take back. Just for you to get an example of this, there's a chapter in Scott Horton's book, Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, where he tells the story of, I believe, the Korengal Valley. The U.S. went in there and the people didn't even realize that the Americans weren't the Soviets just because the Soviets were the invading army last time. The Soviet Union had fallen 10 years prior. So, these people are isolated, but they are, armed and they're willing to fight whoever the invaders are. In the interview with Joanne Leone, Major Danny Sjursen wasn't too optimistic and, saying that he thought we would be in Afghanistan another 3 years, at least, a minimum of 20 years. And as insane as that sounds, it doesn't seem like there's any reason for the United States to stop now. Even the shooting of the commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan doesn't get all that much media attention. Of course, he was unharmed, but still, I feel like this should have been a huge deal. The fact that the war is going so poorly, most people don't even know. Or probably view the Taliban as like a small group of insurrection to the government. they like plot terror attacks more than actually control territory and govern. But the reality is that the war is going really poorly for the Americans, and maybe it will be President Donald Trump or whoever else comes next that, could save us from this catastrophe. All right, Syria. So just to highlight first, I think the two big U.S. policy moves in Syria that we should look at are the CIA program, and that was to arm and support the Sunni resistance to Assad. As predicted in a 2012 DIA memo signed off by then, I believe, Director of National Intelligence Michael Flynn, outlines how this CIA program risked the weapons falling into the hands of the most extreme fighters and then them forming an Islamic caliphate that stretches into Iraq. Stunningly, this is absolutely what happened. You even have emissions from the U.S. government. John Kerry, as Secretary of State, admits that the U.S. thought they could manage the rise of ISIS and use them to help collapse the Assad regime in Syria. And the weapons also fell into the hands of other jihadists like Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, HTS, whatever you want to call this group. That is, the people loyal to Jilani and Zawahiri. Very dangerous bunch. They blow themselves up. And even then, when you look at the other groups that aren't necessarily Osama bin Laden believing jihadists, they're really not moderates. They always talked about the mythical moderates around this time. Oh, we're just arming the moderates. Well, the moderates, I don't think were more moderate than Assad. Not that Syria was a liberal paradise prior to 2011, but people of non-Muslim faiths were allowed to worship there. The Kurds had stability and autonomy from Damascus. There was a lot of oppression. And I'm sure Assad, I don't know if he personally ever murdered someone, but probably had people murdered, tortured. He passed laws that restricted freedom of speech and all this other kind of stuff. But the people that we were arming to overthrow Assad would have done all that and probably more. There's an interview of the Scott Horton show. Conn Hallinan is the guest. I'm going to link to it on the show notes page, talking just about kind of what's left of the resistance to Assad, including these forces in Idlib. And so if you kind of want more detail about that resistance, you could look there. But it does seem so far that ceasefire is holding that was negotiated between Russia and Turkey to remove the more jihadist fighters away from the main highway that runs from Aleppo to Hama. And, I guess allowing a lot more commerce in Syria. The other leg of the U.S. program was the Pentagon program, and that was to arm and support, including with airstrikes, the Syrian Kurds. Of course, there's a lot of complications with supporting the Kurds in Syria, including, the U.S. NATO ally Turkey views the Syrian Kurds as more or less the same group as the Turkish Kurds, who are frequently openly at war with the central state in Ankara of Turkey. So this was a big problem from Erdogan from the very start. Erdogan's the Turkish president. And it's also a move opposed by a lot of other governments in the region. Just because I believe the Kurds are still the largest minority group without their own state of some kind. They're like a 20% minority in 3 states or so, in minorities as well in Iran and Azerbaijan. So the Pentagon program had its problems. However, the Kurds, I guess, at least are not extremist or people who believe in, enforcing strict Islamist law. That being said, again, the Kurdish culture and the laws that they would enforce would be no paradise, and isn't like, we're backing liberal Democrats in Syria, even when we're backing the Kurds. With the backing and support of the United States, the Syrian Kurds were able to retake pretty much all the territory in Syria east of the Euphrates River, minus a small pocket along the Euphrates River Valley that's still held by the Islamic State. They actually moved west of the Euphrates River in northern Syria, and I think have, for the most part, been driven back across the river, minus a small amount of territory held in the Aleppo province of Syria. Turkey has launched 1 or 2, operations now against the Syrian Kurds. The first was called Euphrates Shield, and this pushed Syrian Kurds back to the city of Manbij, and then there is an agreement with the United States and Turkey to move the Syrian Kurds out of Manbij as well and all east of the Euphrates River. And, the United States said they lived up to that agreement, although the Turks are saying the United States has not, and the Kurds are still in Manbij. And then Operation Olive Branch, which was an invasion of the northern part of the Aleppo province. I believe it does border Turkey. It was a little enclave of Kurdish forces, and Turkey invaded. Pretty brutal invasion. Quite a few civilians died there. Ethnic redistribution going on now. Turkey moving in more friendly people to them, because of their opposition to the Kurdish people. Turkey officially ended Operation Olive Branch. However, Euphrates Shield remains ongoing. I believe there's a lot of the former kind of Syrian rebels now in these Euphrates Shield. I'm sure in large part because they're hired by the Turkish government. There's been reports of, Turkey kind of hiring and utilizing Al-Qaeda fighters in this way. Erdogan has long threatened to attack the Kurds in eastern Syria. That looks like it's finally beginning. Erdogan said on Tuesday that Turkey was going to crush the Kurds, and then they began shelling at least 4 places on the Turkish border with Syria there. At least 4 people died in these attacks. I believe the Kurds are pointing out that more died. Right here, I guess it's worth talking about how the Khashoggi murder could be impacting this. This is something that I'm guessing that Turkey has wanted to do for quite a long time. And I think the United States wants to continue their relationship with Saudi Arabia and put this whole Khashoggi thing behind them if they could. I don't think the morality of that situation is all that important to the leadership of the United States of America. And, this is more a PR disaster than anything else. Because this killing happened at a Saudi consulate in Turkey, I think Turkey has a little bit of leverage over the United States now, and, being able to decide how big of a deal is made here and how thorough of an investigation is done and how guilty is Mohammed bin Salman in all these crimes. And so I'm guessing there's a lot of politics going on behind the scene, but I'm sure Erdogan feels emboldened. Again, I don't think Erdogan particularly cares about, getting justice for Jamal Khashoggi and his family, or, bringing a murderer to justice. It's more about, his politics and his game and his lust for power as well. Hopefully this, Turkish invasion is limited, and, we don't see a whole lot of fighting going on in northern Syria, just because, these people have been through so much. And in the interview with Conn, Hallinan, Scott Horton talks about how, I believe, Patrick Coburn described the Syrian civil war as 4D chess with 7 players and no rules. It's just an absurd situation that's, never gonna make any sense. And if Turkey carries out an invasion of Syria, it only gets a lot more complicated. That doesn't mean that there isn't a resolution to this thing. And Conn Hallinan talks about how, there's negotiations to be had. My thinking is, and I just can never understand why, the Kurds haven't done this by now, is cut a deal with Assad as soon as possible, and then try to, get this set up as a situation where they have a lot of autonomy, but if they get a deal with Assad, then maybe they could get Assad's protection from Turkey. I find it hard to see how there's not going to be more fighting, at least in the northern areas of Syria, in the Idlib province. It does seem like there's at least some faction of the Syrian rebel fighters there that number up to 70,000, who really do want to continue the fight against Assad, and I don't think would really settle for a solution that just kind of calls for an end of the war and the reabsorption, and the Syrian army deployed to the Idlib province. Last, Libya here. Of course, this is Obama and Hillary's war in 2001. Also, you could thank U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power was a big driver behind this one. Of course, by trying to, what she called prevent another Rwanda situation, it ends up becoming a much greater crisis. So the United States and NATO, we did this under kind of the guise of NATO in order to circumvent the Constitution, start a war against Gaddafi, in support of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which definitely included jihadist portions of that group. They brutally kill Gaddafi, and then the country fractures and falls apart. There were a lot of things that could have prevented this war. There's a lot of misinformation about the starting, of the war and Gaddafi's alleged threat to commit a massacre in Benghazi. However, what we could, no matter what was going on in Libya beforehand, the situation since is worse. It's state with slave trade. They auction people off. There's rampant sex trafficking, human trafficking. Migrants are dying by the thousands in the Mediterranean Sea. ISIS is seizing territory. There's a warlord controlling like half of the country, and is probably even the strongest ruler of the country now, whose forces has committed countless war crimes. The other half of the country is fractured. The airport in the capital city of Tripoli can't even stay open all the time because rebel groups and different factions there are shelling the airport. In central Syria, you've had an ongoing ISIS presence. This got so bad that in 2016, Obama had to drop 500 bombs on the city of Sirte, Syria, to chase the ISIS fighters out of there. But they're not gone. In fact, they just took a smaller city, I guess town in central Syria, stole some weapons, burned some buildings, and then blew up their pursuers on the way out of town. So ISIS is far from defeated in Libya. The humanitarian situation is unbelievably bad. And, this one's really all Obama and Hillary's fault. All right, that's where I'll wrap it up for the week. High note. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. I got a few new patrons in the past week. I really appreciate to everybody who donates. I mean, it really does make a difference. It's a big motivator to keep doing the show, to know that, there's a few of you out there who really like the show enough to support it. It's like, giving me the feedback that what I'm doing is worth it. So I hope you're doing that, sharing the show, and checking out the show notes page, because a lot of good stuff linked there today. Thanks, everyone.